The dying September light bled crimson across the Snake River ford as Evangeline Porter pressed her spine against the wagon's weathered planks, her calico dress torn at the shoulder where it had snagged on a rusted nail. The mules thrashed in their traces, foam flecking their bits, their terrified screams piercing the evening air like harbingers of approaching doom. "Mama, if your spirit can see me now, give me the strength you always said I possessed." The memory struck her with brutal clarity. Her mother's fevered hand gripping hers during those final winter nights, Eleanor's voice barely above a whisper. "Promise me, Evangeline. Promise you'll never let any man own you the way Cornelius has tried to own our land." Those last words haunted her as she stared at the wagon wheel lying snapped clean through on these cursed rocks, stranding her in the middle of nowhere with darkness falling fast over Dakota territory. The sound of approaching hoofbeats thundered across the prairie like the drumroll of Judgment Day itself. 4 riders materialized from the cottonwoods, their silhouettes stark against the blood-red sky. The man in front sat his midnight stallion with the casual arrogance of a king surveying his vast domain. Reginald Montgomery Stonehart, and they whispered his name in every saloon from here to Deadwood, wore a tailored eastern coat despite the frontier, setting his Spencer carbine gleaming like a scepter of absolute power. Behind him rode his trinity of killers, Black Jack with a bone-handled knife at his belt, Crowfoot silent as winter death itself, and Quiet Quentin, whose pale, unblinking eyes seemed to see straight into a person's soul and find it wanting. Evangeline's trembling fingers found her father's old Colt Navy beneath the wagon's seat, wrapped in oil-stained cloth. 6 shots against 4 armed devils. The mathematics of survival had never looked more hopeless. Montgomery dismounted with theatrical grace, his polished boots splashing through the shallow crossing. Water droplets caught the dying light like drops of fresh blood. Miss Evangeline Porter, I do believe. She had never laid eyes on him before this moment, yet his reputation preceded him like the sulphurous smoke from his stamping mills. Owner of half of Deadwood, master of the Quicksilver mine, and collector of more human souls than the devil himself. When Stoneheart Montgomery came calling, folks either paid their debts in full or simply vanished into the vastness of the territory. "You got the wrong girl, mister." Montgomery's pale eyes studied her face with unsettling intensity. And for just a moment, his confident expression flickered with something that looked almost like recognition. "Those eyes," he murmured so quietly she almost missed it. Then louder with renewed certainty. "Oh, I reckon I don't have the wrong girl at all." He produced a yellowed document from his coat official territorial seals, gleaming like fresh wounds in the fading light. "This here's a marriage contract signed by your dear stepfather, Cornelius Porter. Gambling debts accumulated during his wild nights in Deadwood spring of 1877. Says clear as day that I own his stepdaughter's hand in settlement of said financial obligations." The words struck her like physical blows to the chest. Even from beyond the grave, Cornelius had died in that suspicious riding accident 6 months past. He continued finding new ways to destroy what remained of her life. She remembered discovering his broken body that morning beside the creek, his neck twisted at an unnatural angle. The territorial sheriff had ruled it an accident, but now darker possibilities began forming in her mind. "That paper ain't worth a spit to moisten it." Montgomery's smile was worse than a rattlesnake's warning rattle. County clerk signed it legal and proper. Territorial judge witnessed every line. "Far as the law of this territory goes, you belong to me now, sweetheart." His cold gaze swept the empty prairie, stretching endlessly in all directions. "And there ain't a living soul out here inclined to argue different." Black Jack spurred his mount closer, muddy water spraying from his horse's hooves. The knife at his belt caught her attention, its handle carved with intricate buffalo skulls that seemed to watch her with hollow, accusing eyes. "Boss wants himself a wife, he gets one," the outlaw drawled with obvious relish. Whether she's breathing regular or not don't make much difference to the preacher, if you catch my meaning. Course, I'm what you might call a reasonable man. Montgomery continued, leveling the Spencer carbine directly at her heart with casual menace. Sign this paper here saying you accept the arrangement willing-like, and we'll have ourselves a nice proper church wedding back in town. Refuse my generous offer. The unfinished threat hung in the evening air like gun smoke. Evangeline's pulse thundered in her ears as she weighed her impossible options. Fight and die here in the mud like a rabid animal, or submit to a living hell as Montgomery's legal property. Neither choice offered much in the way of hope, but at least dying would mean staying free until the very end. Her hand crept toward the hidden Colt just as an arrow sprouted from Montgomery's rifle stock with a solid, satisfying thunk. The weapon spun from his grasp, splashing uselessly into the muddy water as he unleashed a stream of creative profanity. The mounted riders wheeled their horses, frantically scanning the darkening tree line for threats. Another arrow whispered past Crowfoot's ear, close enough to part his greasy hair and pin a molted eagle feather to the cottonwood bark behind him. "Show yourself, you red heathen!" Montgomery roared, clawing desperately for his holstered sidearm. A figure stepped from the gathering shadows, like death given human form. Tall and lean, wearing smoke-darkened buckskin that had seen hard use with a Winchester rifle held steady in work-hardened hands. His coal-black hair hung in a single warrior's braid, still damp from river crossing, and a jagged scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, the kind of mark earned facing cavalry sabers in close combat. Lakota Sioux, Evangeline realized, with a mixture of desperate hope and primitive fear. She had seen his people in Deadwood, sometimes trading furs and intricate beadwork with the few merchants brave enough to deal fairly. But this one was different somehow. Dangerous in the way that wolves were dangerous. His obsidian eyes fixed on Montgomery with a hatred that ran much deeper than prairie wells. 4 armed men against 1 defenseless woman. The warrior said his English clear but touched with the musical cadence of his native tongue. "Where I come from, we got a particular name for that kind of courage." Montgomery's pale face flushed an ugly scarlet. "This ain't none of your concern, savage. The girl's legally mine by right of properly witnessed contract." "Your law," the warrior replied with obvious contempt. His penetrating gaze shifted to Evangeline, and something profound passed between them, a recognition of shared oppression, perhaps. He had seen that same helpless terror in his own people's eyes when white men with official papers and loaded guns arrived to decide their fate. "Move when I move," he said quietly, the words meant only for her ears. A strange calm flooded through her chest at his steady, controlled tone. This man truly understood what it meant to be treated as property by those with power. She nodded once, tightening her grip on the wagon's splintered side. Thunder split the evening air as Montgomery's Colt barked orange flame. The warrior dove sideways behind a fallen cottonwood log, and Evangeline scrambled desperately after him, her heavy skirts tangling around her legs. Blackjack and Crowfoot spurred their mounts forward with wild whoops, guns blazing like the fires of hell, while quiet Quentin circled wide to cut off any possible escape route. "Breathe with me," the warrior commanded, pressing close behind their makeshift barricade. His shoulder touched hers, solid as granite bedrock, radiating controlled strength and deadly purpose. She could feel his heartbeat steady as ceremonial drumming, not frantic and panicked like her own racing pulse. Bullets chewed bark chunks from the log above their heads, showering them with splinters. The warrior rose just enough to loose 3 precise shots with his Winchester. One of the horses screamed in mortal agony and collapsed, pitching its rider into the rocky shallows with a tremendous splash. "The river," he whispered urgently. "Can you swim?" "Some. Not well, but certainly better than remaining here for target practice." "Stay low. Follow my lead exactly. They broke from cover together, running hunched over toward the deeper water downstream. A rifle cracked behind them. Evangeline felt the bullet's wind kiss her left cheek. The warrior grunted sharply, stumbled slightly, but kept moving with grim determination. Dark stains began spreading across his shirt sleeve. The shock of cold water hit like winter's merciless slap, driving the breath from her lungs in a sharp gasp. The current caught them immediately, pulling them away from the ford toward a bend thick with cattails and concealing watergrass. Behind them, Montgomery's voice echoed across the darkening water, ugly with frustrated rage and murderous intent. "Find them, you worthless dogs. I want that girl brought back breathing, and I want that red devil's scalp decorating my office wall by morning." They allowed the river to carry them until the angry voices faded to distant whispers, then struggled desperately to shore among the marsh rushes. The warrior hauled himself onto the muddy bank, with obvious effort, breathing hard, his wounded arm pressed tight against his ribs. Evangeline crawled up beside him, her sodden dress clinging to her body like a burial shroud. "You're hit worse than you're letting on." "Just a graze," he insisted, but she could see crimson seeping steadily between his fingers in the pale moonlight. "Let me tend to it properly." She had doctored enough cuts and scrapes during her years helping Mama care for the settlement's various injuries. This wound would need immediate cleaning and binding, or infection would claim him within days. He studied her face for a long measuring moment, then nodded curtly. She tore strips from her already tattered petticoat, fashioning crude but effective bandages around his bicep. Her hands shook not from the cold river water alone, but from everything that had shattered and changed in the space of mere heartbeats. "What's your name?" she asked, trying to distract them both from the gravity of their situation. "Ohanzi," he replied, wincing slightly as she tightened the binding. "It means shadow in my people's tongue." "I'm Evangeline." She met his dark eyes, directly seeing gold flecks that caught the moonlight. "Why did you risk your life to help me?" "You don't even know who I am." His scarred face remained unreadable in the darkness, but his voice carried depths of pain and understanding. No man should own a woman like he might own a horse or a head of cattle. "My people have learned what it means to be treated as property by those who wield power over the powerless." They huddled together in the concealing marsh grass, sharing vital body heat, while Montgomery's men searched the far bank with blazing torches that danced like angry spirits in the night. Her face was mere inches from his, close enough to smell river water and leather and something else, indefinable sage smoke from sacred fires perhaps. His breath warmed her cheek as they waited in tense silence for the searchers to move on. "What happens to us now?" she whispered. "Now we become what they cannot catch or hold." He replied, his calloused hand finding hers in the darkness. Their fingers intertwined with surprising gentleness. Shadows dancing on the wind. The next 4 days brought brutal travel across seemingly endless expanses of buffalo grass and sage flats, following game trails that only Ohanzi could read, heading toward a destination he revealed slowly and with obvious caution. Evangeline's feet had blistered raw inside her leather boots, but she matched his punishing pace without complaint or request for rest, earning his growing respect with each mile covered. He spoke little during their flight, communicating mostly through economical gestures, pointing out dangerous gopher holes that might trip their stolen horses, warning her silently of rattlesnakes sunning themselves on warm rocks, indicating the few safe places where they could risk brief stops when exhaustion threatened to topple her from the saddle. On the third night, camping in a hidden canyon where no firelight could betray their position, a sudden autumn storm struck with prairie fury. Lightning split the sky while thunder crashed around them like artillery bombardment, and freezing rain turned their shelter into a miserable ice cave. When Evangeline began shivering uncontrollably, her lips turning blue with dangerous cold, Hansi made a decision that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. "We have to share warmth, or you'll die of exposure," he said matter-of-factly, spreading his buffalo robe wide. "Turn your back and lie against me. Nothing improper will happen. This is simple survival." She nodded wordlessly, too cold and exhausted to feel embarrassment. They lay pressed together throughout that endless night, his arm curved protectively around her waist, her head pillowed on his shoulder. She could feel his steady heartbeat against her back, could smell the sage smoke that seemed permanently woven into his clothes and hair. Sometime before dawn, still half asleep, she turned in his arms, so they lay face to face in the darkness. "Tell me about your brother," she whispered. "The one who was murdered." His body tensed, but after a long moment he began speaking in low, careful tones. "Lakota." His name meant friend to everyone, and it suited him perfectly. He had 2 small children, a son and daughter. When the drought came last summer, he rode out looking for water holes the army maps didn't show. Found a good spring on what used to be Lakota land, but the freight company claimed it was theirs now. Ohenzi's voice grew harder. The guards said he was stealing their water, shot him down without warning, left his body for the buzzards and coyotes. His children waited 3 days for him to come home. "I'm so sorry." Evangeline breathed her heart breaking for his loss. "The men who killed him work for Montgomery now. I've been tracking them for 8 months, following their trail of cruelty and violence." His eyes reflected what little starlight penetrated their shelter. "That's why I was at the river crossing. I knew they would come that way eventually." "What will you do when you find them?" "Make them answer for what they did. Make them pay the price that justice demands." She understood then that she had become part of something much larger than her own desperate flight from an unwanted marriage. Ohenzi wasn't just helping her escape Montgomery's legal trap, he was hunting the killers who had destroyed his family. Their fates had been bound together by more than mere chance. "There's something else you should know," she said slowly. "About my mother. She didn't die naturally like everyone believes." Ohenzi turned his head to look at her more directly. "What do you mean?" "She was getting better from the fever, the doctor said so. But then Cornelius brought her some special medicine he claimed to have bought in town. After she drank it..." Evangeline's voice broke slightly. "She was dead within hours. And the way Montgomery looked at me tonight, like he recognized something. I think he knew her before she married my father." "You think Montgomery had her poisoned?" "I don't know for certain. But too many people close to that man seem to die convenient deaths." She pressed closer to Ohenzi's warmth, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "I'm frightened of what else he might be capable of." "Then we'll have to be smarter and more careful than he is," Ohenzi said grimly. "Because I suspect our troubles with Stoneheart Montgomery are far from over." The hidden Lakota camp appeared like a mirage among the cottonwoods near Willow Springs, so perfectly concealed that Evangeline would have ridden past without noticing if Ohenzi hadn't guided her directly to its entrance. 5 buffalo-hide teepees were arranged in the traditional sacred circle, with smoke rising from carefully banked cook fires. The people who emerged to witness their arrival moved with the cautious dignity of survivors who had learned never to trust easily. An older woman with silver-streaked braids stepped forward, first Ohenzi's sister, a pony, who appeared to be in her 30s, but whose face bore the lined exhaustion of someone who had buried too many loved ones. Behind her stood an ancient man, whose milk-white eyes seemed to see more than most people with perfect vision, and 2 children who peered around their elders' protective forms with undisguised curiosity. "My sister grows suspicious of strangers," Ohanzi explained as Aponi spoke rapidly in Lakota, her tone sharp with obvious concern. She fears bringing you here endangers the children. The children are Nighties and Bly, Evangeline asked, remembering what he had told her earlier. Orphans from the agency raids 2 summers past. Their parents were killed trying to prevent soldiers from taking them to the boarding schools. His jaw tightened with controlled anger. The old man is Whisperwind, our grandfather. He has the gift of seeing truth where others find only lies and confusion. Whisperwind stepped forward, slowly studying Evangeline's face with those clouded eyes that seemed to penetrate straight to her soul. He spoke in Lakota, his voice like wind through autumn grass, and whatever he said caused Aponi's expression to soften slightly. What did he tell her? That the Spirit sent you to us for reasons we don't yet understand, but that those reasons will become clear when the time is right. Ohanzi's mouth quirked in what might have been amusement. My grandfather has always been something of a mystic, but his visions usually prove accurate in the end. He led her to a teepee set, slightly apart from the others, his own dwelling, she realized. Inside, buffalo robes covered the ground in comfortable arrangements, and a small fire burned within a carefully constructed circle of river stones. The space smelled of wood smoke and tanned hide, foreign, but not unpleasant to someone raised in a sod brick farmhouse. You can rest here tonight, he said, kneeling to add dried grass to the flames. Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next in this deadly game Montgomery is playing. Evangeline sank gratefully onto one of the soft robes, suddenly aware of bone-deep weariness that threatened to drag her into unconsciousness, despite the dangers still pursuing them. Her dress remained damp from repeated river crossings, and prairie mud was caked on her boots nearly to the knee. She must look like something wild animals had dragged through thorns and brambles. I need you to understand something important, she said as Ohanzi tended the fire with practiced efficiency. About that contract Montgomery showed me at the river. He glanced up, firelight dancing across his scarred features in hypnotic patterns that made him look both dangerous and oddly beautiful. My stepfather Cornelius was never what you'd call a good man, even on his best days. He married my mother purely for her land and then spent the next 10 years drinking and gambling away everything we'd worked so hard to build. She hugged her knees against her chest, seeking warmth and comfort. After Mama died last winter, I thought I was finally free of his poison and his debts. Reckon I was mighty wrong about that. Men like Montgomery always find ways to own what they desire most. Ohanzi replied quietly, but she could hear barely controlled fury burning beneath his calm words. My brother learned that truth the hard way last year. During the next 3 days, while they waited for Montgomery's search parties to move on to other areas, Evangeline gradually found her place within the small Lakota community. Aponi taught her how to prepare pemmican and cure buffalo hide, while the children delighted in hearing stories about life in the white settlements. She learned basic words in their language and began to understand the subtle hand signals they used for silent communication during hunting expeditions. Most importantly, she and Ohanzi spent long hours talking by the fire each evening, sharing pieces of their respective histories, and slowly building the foundation of trust that would be essential for whatever trials lay ahead. She told him about her mother's gentle strength and love of learning, about the small school Eleanor had tried to start for the settlement children before Cornelius forbade it as unnatural for a woman. He spoke of the old ways his people had followed before the soldiers came, of the sacred ceremonies and seasonal migrations that had sustained his tribe for countless generations. The children here will never know that life, he said sadly on their final evening in camp. They'll grow up speaking English, wearing white man's clothes, probably ashamed of their true heritage. Maybe that's the only way they'll survive in the world your people have made. But something precious dies with each generation that forgets. It doesn't have to be that way, Evangeline insisted. There could be schools that honor both worlds, that teach children to read and write while still preserving their own culture and traditions. A beautiful dream, Ohanzi said with a bitter smile. But dreams don't often survive contact with reality in Dakota territory. On their fourth morning in the camp, Whisper Wind approached Evangeline while she was helping a pony repair a torn teepee cover. The old man spoke at length in Lakota, gesturing occasionally toward the eastern horizon, where the smoke from distant settlements could sometimes be seen. "What is he saying?" she asked when he finished. A pony's expression was troubled as she translated. "He says, the shadow of death hangs over the mining town, growing darker each day. Many people will die before the next full moon, unless someone with courage acts to stop the poison at its source." "Montgomery," Evangeline breathed. "Grandfather believes you are the key to preventing this catastrophe, though he cannot see exactly how. He says you must return to the place of danger, but you will not go alone." A pony looked meaningfully at her brother. "The Shadow Warrior will walk beside you into the heart of darkness." That afternoon, they prepared to leave the hidden sanctuary that had become more of a home to Evangeline than any place she had known since her mother's death. The children clung to her skirts, begging her to stay, and even a pony embraced her with genuine warmth despite their short acquaintance. "Come back to us when your battle is won," the older woman said in careful English. "There will always be a place for you here, sister." "I promise," Evangeline replied, tears stinging her eyes. "Whatever happens, I'll find a way to return." As they rode eastward toward Deadwood and the confrontation that awaited them there, she realized that she was no longer the same desperate, frightened girl who had been trapped at that river crossing. The woman riding beside Ohanzi had learned to survive in the wilderness, to find strength in community, to see beauty and wisdom in ways of life completely different from her own upbringing. Most importantly, she had found someone who valued her for who she truly was, not what she might represent or provide. The growing bond between them wasn't based on legal contracts or social convenience, but on mutual respect earned through shared hardship and danger. "Are you ready for this?" Ohanzi asked as the smokestacks of Deadwood appeared on the horizon. "No," she replied honestly, "but I'm ready to try." They reached the outskirts of Deadwood as the sun set behind the black hills, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold that seemed ominous rather than beautiful. The mining town sprawled across its narrow gulch like an infected wound, all ramshackle buildings and muddy streets illuminated by oil lamps, and the hellish glow from stamping mills that operated around the clock. The air itself seemed poisonous, thick with wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and the distinctive sulfur stench from Montgomery's mercury amalgamation process. Even at this distance, Evangeline could taste the metallic tang on her tongue and feel it burning in her lungs. "We need information before we can act," Ohanzi said, as they made their way carefully through the town's maze of back alleys and side streets, avoiding the main thoroughfares where Montgomery's watchers might spot them. "Someone who knows the layout of his operation and can tell us where his vulnerabilities lie." "Dr. Edwin," Evangeline suggested. "You said he owed you a favor." They found the physician's clinic on the second floor of a building near the town center, marked by a painted shingle that creaked mournfully in the evening breeze. Edwin himself answered their soft knock, a man in his 40s, with prematurely gray hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. His blood-stained apron and calloused hands spoke of someone who worked tirelessly to heal rather than harm. "Ohanzi," he said with genuine warmth, though his voice remained carefully low. "I wondered when you might come calling again. And you've brought a companion in obvious need of medical attention." "She needs help, Edwin. We both do in more ways than just physical. The doctor ushered them inside quickly, barring the door behind them with obvious nervousness. His clinic was spartanly furnished, but scrupulously clean, equipped with an examination table, glass-fronted medicine cabinets, and a desk piled high with ledgers and correspondence. "Let me guess the nature of your troubles," Edwin said, washing his hands thoroughly in a basin of carbolic solution. "Stoneheart Montgomery and his collection of killers have taken an unhealthy interest in your welfare. Word travels fast in a town this size, I reckon. Half of Deadwood's been buzzing for days about Montgomery hunting some runaway bride and the savage who allegedly stole her away. The other half's wondering why a supposedly respectable businessman needs 4 armed murderers to retrieve one frightened young woman." Edwin's mouth tightened with disgust as he examined Ohanzi's partially healed wound. What they don't realize is that Montgomery's definition of respectable differs considerably from most people's understanding of the word. While he worked cleaning and rebandaging the bullet graze with professional efficiency, Edwin talked in the casual manner that doctors often use to distract patients from pain. But his words carried darker undertones that made both Evangeline and Ohanzi listen carefully. "Montgomery's been pressuring me for weeks to sign safety certificates for his mining operations," the physician explained. "Claims he needs official medical approval for some revolutionary new extraction process he's planning to implement. Offered me a considerable sum of money to overlook certain irregularities in his current methods." "What sort of irregularities?" Evangeline asked with growing alarm. Edwin's hands paused momentarily in their work. "Systematic mercury poisoning among his workers. Deliberate contamination of water sources downstream from the processing mills. Miners developing severe lung diseases from prolonged exposure to toxic dust and chemical vapors." He resumed bandaging with grim determination. "The kind of irregularities that could shut down his entire operation permanently if territorial authorities ever learned the full truth." "But you refused his offer." "A physician's first duty is to do no harm," Edwin replied simply. "Besides, Montgomery's not exactly known for honoring his bargains once he obtains what he wants. Ask anyone who's ever tried to collect on a debt he owes." Ohanzi sat up carefully as the doctor finished his ministrations. "Can you help us prove that Montgomery's marriage contract is fraudulent?" "What makes you believe it is?" Evangeline explained her suspicions about the suspicious dates and circumstances surrounding the supposed agreement between Montgomery and her stepfather. Edwin listened with growing fascination, occasionally asking pointed questions that revealed his sharp legal mind. "If your theory is correct," he said finally, "then the entire document is legally worthless. But proving deliberate forgery would require access to Montgomery's private records, and he keeps those locked away more securely than the territorial mint keeps its gold reserves." "What about the county clerk who supposedly witnessed the signing?" Evangeline suggested. "This Horatio Franklin fellow?" Edwin's expression grew troubled. "Horatio's a fundamentally decent man, but Montgomery has him completely terrorized. Threatened to foreclose on his house and leave his family homeless if he doesn't cooperate with whatever schemes Stoneheart devises." The doctor moved to his desk, withdrawing a thick, leather-bound ledger filled with meticulous handwriting. "Still, there might be another approach to this problem. I keep comprehensive records of all my patients and their various difficulties, including several of Montgomery's men who've sought treatment over the years for injuries sustained during activities their employer would prefer to keep private." "What sort of activities?" Ohanzi asked with obvious interest. "The kind that result in bullet wounds, knife cuts, and broken bones injuries that decent people don't typically acquire through honest labor." Edwin flipped through several pages with practiced efficiency. including one particularly significant case from last autumn. A man calling himself Black Jack seeking treatment for a bullet wound in his shoulder. Paid in gold coin and refused to provide his real name or explain the circumstances of his injury. Evangeline leaned closer, studying the carefully recorded entry. The date was from late 1878, very close to the time when Ohanzi's brother had been murdered. But here's what made this case memorable. Edwin continued with evident satisfaction. Black Jack was carrying a distinctive weapon when he came for treatment, a knife with an elaborately carved bone handle decorated with buffalo skulls. I remember it clearly because he became extremely agitated when I tried to examine the blade, claiming it was a trophy he'd taken from some Indian he'd killed in self-defense. Ohanzi went perfectly still, his scarred face hardening into an expression of deadly purpose. Describe this knife in precise detail. Approximately 8 inches long with a slightly curved blade of excellent steel. The handle was decorated with what appeared to be authentic Lakota beadwork of extraordinarily fine quality. Edwin looked between them intently. Does this description have particular significance? That knife belonged to my brother Lakota. Ohanzi said quietly, his voice thick with suppressed emotion and carefully controlled rage. It was a gift from our grandfather, crafted by our grandmother's own hands. The only thing of real value he possessed when the freight guards murdered him. The silence that followed was heavy with implications none of them wanted to voice aloud. If Black Jack was carrying Lakota's knife, then he was directly involved in the killing. Which meant Montgomery's crew wasn't merely engaged in illegal mining operations and document forgery. They were cold-blooded murderers, operating with complete impunity under Stoneheart's protection. There's something else you both need to understand, Edwin said, dropping his voice to barely above a whisper. Montgomery isn't just planning to expand the Quicksilver mine using conventional methods. He's preparing to implement a revolutionary mercury amalgamation process that will increase gold extraction by tenfold or more. But this new technique requires truly massive quantities of fresh, clean water, far more than the existing creek system can possibly provide. The Snake River headwaters. Evangeline breathed with sudden, sickening understanding. Exactly. With legal control of those water rights, Montgomery could become the wealthiest and most powerful man in Dakota Territory. Possibly the richest individual west of the Mississippi River. Edwin's expression grew increasingly grave. Without access to that water source, however, his revolutionary process becomes completely worthless. Which explains why he's so desperately determined to marry you, Miss Porter. It's not just about possessing you as a woman. It's about controlling the key to an industrial empire built on poison and death. A sudden commotion in the street below made all three of them freeze like deer, sensing approaching wolves. Harsh voices shouted back and forth in the darkness, and heavy boots tramped along the wooden sidewalks with military precision. Montgomery's searchers making their presence known throughout the town with deliberate intimidation. You cannot remain here any longer, Edwin said urgently, already moving toward a back window that offered access to the building's an external wooden stair. They'll search every structure in Deadwood before sunrise, and I can't protect you if they find you in my clinic. Yar, where can we go that might be safe? There's a school teacher named Mary who runs educational classes for... He paused delicately. Well, let's say she provides learning opportunities for children that territorial law claims shouldn't receive formal education. She might be willing to offer temporary sanctuary if you can reach her without being detected. Edwin quickly scribbled an address on a scrap of paper. Tell her I sent you with my strongest personal recommendation. But be extremely careful navigating the streets after dark. Montgomery's men shoot first and ask questions later when they encounter anyone they consider suspicious. They slipped out through the back entrance, using a maze of external wooden stairs and narrow alleyways to avoid the main thoroughfares where armed searchers prowled with lanterns and shotguns. The address led them to a modest house on Deadwood's outskirts, where warm candlelight flickered behind carefully drawn curtains. Mary answered their gentle knock after a long, cautious pause. A woman in her 30s with steel-gray hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to miss absolutely nothing. She wore a simple dress and practical apron, but there was unmistakable strength in her posture that spoke of someone who had faced down considerable adversity and emerged victorious. "Dr. Edwin sent us," Evangeline said quietly, mindful of potentially listening ears in neighboring buildings. Mary studied them both for several tense moments, clearly weighing risks and benefits with practiced calculation. Then she stepped aside to allow their entry, barring the door securely behind them. The front room of her house had been converted into a makeshift classroom complete with rough wooden desks and a blackboard covered with English letters and basic arithmetic problems. But what caught Evangeline's attention immediately were the 5 children seated around a table in the room's center, diligently practicing their letters on slate boards. 2 of the students were obviously white, but the other 3 were clearly Indian Lakota, judging by their distinctive features, and the oldest couldn't have been more than 10 years of age. "My students," Mary explained with obvious pride and defiance. "Their parents work in the mines and mills when employment can be found. The territorial authorities claim that Indian children cannot and should not be educated alongside white children, so—" She shrugged eloquently. "I teach them here after dark, when the law cannot interfere with actual learning." One of the Lakota children looked up from his slate, immediately recognizing Ohanzi despite the dim lighting. He spoke rapidly in their native tongue, excitement bright in his young face, like captured starlight. "He says you're the shadow warrior," Mary translated with evident amusement. "The one who helps people escape from impossible situations when no one else will act." Ohanzi knelt beside the boy's chair, speaking quietly in Lakota for several minutes, while the child nodded solemnly. When the brief conversation ended, the youngster returned to his letters, with renewed concentration and obvious determination. "What did you tell him?" Evangeline asked curiously. "That sometimes even shadows need assistance from friends." Ohanzi replied, straightening with visible effort. "Mary, we desperately need to reach County Clerk Franklin for a private conversation. Can you help us arrange such a meeting?" Horatio Franklin. Mary's expression darkened considerably. "That poor man has been scared of his own shadow ever since Montgomery sank his claws into him. Stoneheart has him signing whatever documents he demands, no questions asked and no explanations given. We have reason to believe Montgomery forced him to forge a legal guardianship document," Evangeline explained carefully. "If we could somehow convince Horatio to admit the truth about what really happened, you'd need solid, undeniable proof that he was coerced into criminal activity. Something Montgomery couldn't explain away or deny." Mary was quiet for several long moments, thinking hard about the problem. There might be a way to approach him safely. Horatio has a well-known weakness for whiskey, especially when he's feeling guilty about something he's been forced to do against his conscience. If you could get him alone and sufficiently intoxicated. She explained that Franklin typically spent his evenings at a saloon called the Lucky Dollar, drinking in solitude while studiously avoiding conversation with other patrons. If they could approach him there when he was deep in his cups and wallowing in self-pity, he might be willing to unburden his conscience to sympathetic listeners. "But I must warn you, it's extremely dangerous," Mary said seriously. "The Lucky Dollar is one of Montgomery's own establishments. His men drink there, regularly conduct their illegal business play cards with marked decks. you'd be walking straight into the proverbial lion's den. We don't seem to have much choice in the matter, O'Hansey replied grimly. As they prepared to leave Mary's protective sanctuary, the schoolteacher pulled Evangeline aside for a private word that sent chills down her spine. There's something you should understand about Montgomery's current situation, she said in hushed, urgent tones. Something that most people in Deadwood don't realize, though the signs are becoming increasingly obvious to those who know what to look for. What do you mean? He's dying slowly, but inevitably, Mary whispered. Dr. Edwin has been treating him secretly for advanced mercury poisoning, the same affliction that's been killing his mine workers for years. All those decades of exposure to the toxic fumes from his amalgamation process have been eating him alive from the inside. Evangeline felt cold dread settling in her stomach like a stone. How much time does he have left? Months at most, possibly only weeks. That's why he's become so desperately determined to expand his operations before his time runs out completely. He wants to build an empire that will survive and remember him long after the poison finally claims his life. Mary's eyes were dark with hard-won knowledge. A dying man with unlimited financial resources and absolutely nothing left to lose is the most dangerous enemy you could possibly face. The Lucky Dollar squatted on a side street like a bloated toad, all low smoke-stained ceilings and air thick enough to cut with a dull knife. Raucous piano music drifted from the main room, mixed with coarse laughter and the occasional crash of breaking furniture as disputes were settled in traditional frontier fashion. Evangeline pulled her shawl higher around her face, trying to make herself as inconspicuous as possible as they approached the establishment's batwing doors. Through the gaps in the swinging panels, she could see the saloon was packed with miners, drifters, and other rough characters, most of them already deep in their evening cups. "You absolutely certain about this approach?" O'Hansey asked one final time. "No," she replied honestly. "But we're going to do it anyway, because all our other options are even worse." They slipped inside cautiously, keeping to the shadows along the wall, like hunting cats stalking their prey. At a round table near the bar, Evangeline spotted Black Jack and Quiet Quentin engaged in what appeared to be a serious card game with two men she didn't recognize. Her blood ran cold as she caught a clear glimpse of that bone-handled knife at Black Jack's belt, the weapon that had belonged to O'Hansey's murdered brother. County Clerk Horatio Franklin sat alone at a corner table, a half-empty whiskey bottle standing before him like a liquid monument to his misery. Deep lines of guilt and terror were etched into his features, and he appeared to be at least a decade older than his actual 50 years. This was clearly a man being slowly destroyed by the weight of his own unwilling complicity in evil. "There's our target," Evangeline whispered, nodding discreetly toward the isolated figure. They made their way through the crowd, with careful stealth, trying to project the appearance of just another couple seeking a quiet table for private conversation. Franklin didn't look up from his glass until they slid into chairs directly across from him. "We need to discuss something extremely important," Evangeline said quietly, leaning forward so her words wouldn't carry to nearby tables. Franklin's bloodshot eyes focused on her face with obvious difficulty, pupils dilated from alcohol and what might have been laudanum. Do I know you, miss? You look familiar somehow, but I can't quite place." "I'm Evangeline Porter. You signed a legal guardianship document supposedly transferring my custody to Reginald Montgomery." The blood drained from Franklin's face so rapidly that Evangeline feared he might faint entirely. He glanced around the saloon with barely concealed panic, as if expecting Montgomery's enforcers to materialize from the tobacco smoke at any moment. "I don't know what you're talking about, miss. I keep very careful, very accurate records of all my official business transactions." "If there was such a document, It would be completely legal and properly witnessed according to territorial law. The document was dated 1877. Ohanzi said, leaning forward with quiet intensity. But according to Dr. Edwin's medical records and other sources we've consulted, the gambling debts it was supposed to cover weren't actually incurred until several months later. That's... Franklin reached for his whiskey glass with visibly shaking hands. That's simply not possible. I maintain absolutely meticulous files of all legal proceedings. There must be some mistake in your information. Then you won't mind checking those meticulous files for complete accuracy. Evangeline pressed gently but persistently. Franklin's fragile composure finally crumbled like a dam bursting under flood pressure. Tears began streaming down his weathered cheeks as he spoke in a voice barely above a tortured whisper. You don't understand what that monster is truly capable of doing to people who cross him. He didn't just threaten me with financial ruin, he held my hand directly in his office fire until I agreed to sign those papers. The flesh actually blistered and peeled while I screamed for mercy. Franklin pulled back his sleeve to reveal horrible burn scars on his right hand and wrist. Then he told me if I ever breathed a word about what really happened, he'd do far worse things to my wife and 3 children. The genuine anguish in his voice made Evangeline feel a powerful stab of sympathy for this broken man. Montgomery's web of intimidation and terror reached much further than she had imagined, ensnaring innocent people through threats against their most vulnerable loved ones. We can protect you and your family, she said earnestly. But we desperately need proof that the guardianship document was deliberately forged. There is no proof left to find anywhere, Franklin replied with bitter despair. Montgomery made absolutely certain of that. All the original records were altered after the fact, made to appear as though the dates and circumstances were completely consistent from the beginning. But you remember the actual truth of what happened. Every single night when I close my eyes to sleep. Franklin's voice was now barely audible above the saloon's background noise. Your stepfather came to me in March of 1877, practically begging me to witness a debt transfer agreement. Said Montgomery would kill him outright if he couldn't make good on his legitimate gambling losses. And those losses were real, miss, $400 in poker debts, all properly documented and witnessed. Then why was it necessary to forge the dates on the guardianship clause? Franklin glanced around the room once more, then leaned even closer with obvious terror. Because the guardianship agreement wasn't part of the original debt settlement at all. Montgomery added that provision later after your mother died of that mysterious fever and left you as sole heir to the Snake River property. He needed legal control over your person to gain access to those water rights. The final pieces of Montgomery's elaborate scheme fell into place with sickening clarity. Stoneheart hadn't simply purchased her stepfather's gambling debts, he had manufactured an entirely fraudulent legal mechanism to claim ownership of her as a person and, through her, the water resources that were essential to his planned mining empire expansion. But before Evangeline could respond to this revelation, a disturbance at the bar interrupted their tense conversation. Black Jack had risen from his card game, pale eyes scanning the crowded room with unmistakable predatory intensity. He spoke briefly to quiet Quentin, who nodded and began moving casually toward the saloon's back exit. They've spotted us, Ohanzi said quietly, his hand moving instinctively toward his concealed weapons. Evangeline's fingers found the grip of her Colt Navy beneath her shawl. What do we do now? We leave immediately while we still can. But as they started to rise from their chairs, Black Jack's voice cut through the saloon's noise like a blade through silk. Well, well, well. Look what we got ourselves here, boys. If it ain't Montgomery's runaway bride and her pet savage having themselves a real cozy little chat with our good friend, the county clerk. The piano music stopped abruptly. Conversations died throughout the room as every eye turned toward their corner table. Evangeline could feel the oppressive weight of hostile stares and the electric tension that inevitably preceded serious violence. County Clerk Franklin. Black Jack continued swaggering toward their table with obvious malicious intent. "You've been discussing Montgomery's private business affairs with folks who ain't got no right whatsoever to know such sensitive information." Franklin tried desperately to shrink deeper into his chair, but there was simply nowhere to hide from the outlaw's menacing presence. "I wasn't. We were just. I mean to say. Just what exactly?" Black Jack's hand rested with casual threat on the carved bone handle of his stolen knife. "Just planning to cause serious trouble for decent businessmen who are trying to make honest livings in this territory." "Leave him be," Evangeline said firmly, stepping forward despite her hammering heartbeat. "Your quarrel is with me, not with him." Black Jack's smile was uglier than a rattlesnake's warning grin. "Oh, we ain't got no quarrel at all, sweetheart. You're gonna come along nice and peaceful-like, and we're all gonna pretend this little conversation never took place. Simple as that. And if I refuse your generous offer, then things are gonna get mighty unpleasant for every single person in this establishment." He replied, his gaze sweeping meaningfully across the other patrons, who were watching with morbid fascination. "Real unpleasant, if you understand my meaning." Ohanzi moved smoothly, positioning himself between Evangeline and the advancing outlaw. "The lady's not going anywhere with you or your boss." "That's where you're dead wrong, Chief." Black Jack drew his knife with a practiced flourish, the blade catching lamplight with wicked gleams. "See, the boss wants his legal property returned to him, and I always make absolutely sure the boss gets exactly what he wants." The weapon glinted as he raised it threateningly, and Evangeline could clearly see the intricate beadwork decorating the handle, authentic Lakota craftsmanship of extraordinarily fine quality. This was indeed the blade that had belonged to Ohanzi's murdered brother, stolen from his corpse by these animals. "You recognize this little beauty, don't you, savage?" Black Jack taunted with obvious sadistic pleasure. "Took it off a stupid Indian last year. Fool thought he could steal water from freight wagons without facing the consequences. Had to teach him the error of his ways slow and permanent-like." Something fundamental and terrifying changed in Ohanzi's expression, a coldness that seemed to make the air itself freeze around them. "You killed him in cold blood." "Oh, I killed him real slow and painful." Black Jack bragged with evident satisfaction. "Made him crawl on his belly and beg for mercy before I finally put him out of his misery. Kept this here knife as a nice souvenir to remember the lesson by." The attack came without any warning or preliminary posturing. Ohanzi moved like his namesake, a shadow, given deadly form and implacable purpose. His fist caught Black Jack squarely in the throat with bone-crushing force, dropping the outlaw to his knees in a choking, gasping heap. The stolen knife skittered across the floor as Evangeline dove desperately after it, her fingers closing around the familiar bone handle. Chaos erupted throughout the saloon like wildfire spreading through dry grass. Quiet Quentin drew his gun with lightning speed, but a whiskey bottle hurled by one of the sympathetic miners caught him directly in the temple, sending him sprawling unconscious across a poker table. Men shouted and cursed, some trying to escape the sudden explosion of violence, others eagerly joining the brawl for reasons of their own. This way. Franklin had somehow found unexpected courage in the bottom of his whiskey glass. He grabbed Evangeline's arm with surprising strength, pulling her toward a side door she hadn't noticed before. "There's an alley behind this building." They burst through the door into cool night air, the sounds of continuing mayhem echoing behind them through the saloon's thin walls. Ohanzi appeared just moments later, blood on his knuckles and fires of vengeance burning bright in his dark eyes. "Did you recover it?" he asked urgently. Evangeline held up the knife with a reverent care. Even in the dim starlight, the beadwork was absolutely exquisite, the kind of painstaking craftsmanship that represented months of patient, loving labor. "Your brother's blade." "Yes." He took the weapon with trembling hands, running his thumb along the carved handle with infinite gentleness. "Now, part of Lakota can finally come home where he belongs." Franklin leaned heavily against the alley wall, breathing hard from unaccustomed physical exertion, and probably more excitement than he'd experienced in years. "They'll come after us now, with everything they've got," he panted. "Montgomery's men never forgive or forget slights like this one." "Then we'd better give them something much more important to worry about," Evangeline said grimly. A dangerous plan was already forming in her mind, probably suicidal, certainly desperate, but potentially their only realistic chance of ending Montgomery's stranglehold once and for all. If she was correct about the forged documents and the broader scope of his criminal operations, then the key to everything lay hidden in his private records. The ones Dr. Edwin had mentioned were locked away more securely than the territorial government's gold reserves. "The mine office," she said slowly, working through the implications. "Montgomery keeps his most important papers at the Quicksilver, doesn't he? In that private safe you mentioned?" Franklin nodded reluctantly. "He's got a massive steel safe in his corner office combination lock, steel plate thick enough to stop rifle bullets." "But why would you want to?" His eyes widened with understanding and horror. "You're not seriously thinking of trying to break into Montgomery's private office? That would be absolute suicide. Because if we can obtain those records, we can prove beyond any doubt that the guardianship document is completely fraudulent," she explained with growing determination. "Expose his entire criminal operation to the territorial authorities and bring his reign of terror to a permanent end." She looked at Ohanzi intently. "But it would mean going straight into the very heart of his domain, where he'll be expecting us to make exactly this kind of desperate move." Ohanzi's scarred face was thoughtful as he considered all the implications and dangers. During daylight hours, the mine complex crawls with armed guards and workers loyal to Montgomery through fear, if not genuine affection. But late at night, most of the employees go home to their families. Franklin finished. Only a skeleton security crew remains on duty to watch the equipment. But Montgomery's office is located on the second floor of the main administrative building, directly above the crushing mills that operate 24 hours a day. Even if you somehow managed to get inside the building undetected, the industrial noise would completely mask any sounds of your approach. It was a completely insane plan, but given their increasingly desperate circumstances, insanity might represent their only viable option for survival. "I know the mine's basic layout from my years keeping Montgomery's financial books." Franklin continued with growing excitement despite his obvious terror. "There's a maintenance tunnel that runs from the main stamping mill directly to the office building. It's used for service access to the steam pipes and line shafts." "You'd actually be willing to help us with this?" Evangeline asked in surprise. Franklin's haggard face was suddenly filled with determined resolve. "That man destroyed my life, my self-respect, everything I once held dear. He turned me into something I'm ashamed to see when I look in mirrors. Maybe it's finally time I did something right for a change. Something I can be proud of when I meet my maker." But as they made their way through pre-dawn darkness toward the Quicksilver mine, A nagging voice in Evangeline's mind kept insisting that they were walking directly into a carefully prepared trap. Montgomery was far too intelligent and too careful to leave his empire genuinely vulnerable to the kind of infiltration they were attempting. Which meant he was either supremely confident in his security measures and defensive preparations, or he was deliberately allowing them to approach, expecting them to make exactly this kind of desperate gamble. The Quicksilver mine sprawled across the hillside like some monstrous metal parasite, all belching smokestacks and thundering machinery that had transformed the surrounding landscape into a poisoned wasteland of slag heaps and contaminated water. Even at this early morning hour, the stamping mills hammered relentlessly at their loads of ore, filling the air with deafening industrial noise that could be heard clearly from miles away. Franklin led them through a maze of equipment and outbuildings, to a drainage culvert that passed beneath the main access road, then up a treacherous rocky slope to where the maintenance tunnel emerged from the hillside. The entrance was barely large enough for a full-grown person to crawl through, concealed behind rusted metal screening and years of accumulated debris. "This leads directly under the administrative building," Franklin explained in whispers that were barely audible above the mechanical thunder. About 50 yards of crawling through some pretty unpleasant conditions, then up through a vertical access shaft. But once you're actually inside the building proper, we understand the risks involved, Ohansey replied calmly. They squeezed through the narrow opening into absolute darkness that pressed against them like a living, malevolent thing. The tunnel was barely 4 feet high, forcing them to crawl forward on hands and knees through sticky mud and pools of standing water that soaked through their clothes within minutes. Steam pipes ran along both walls, radiating intense heat that made the already fetid air thick and nearly impossible to breathe. Evangeline tried not to think about the tons of earth and rock suspended directly above their heads, or what would happen if the tunnel's ancient support structure finally gave way under the accumulated stress. Instead, she focused on following the dim outline of Ohansey's form ahead of her, carefully matching his cautious pace through the treacherous underground passage. The maintenance shaft proved to be a near-vertical climb up rusted iron rungs that were slippery with condensation and decades of neglect. Franklin brought up the rear despite his obvious terror of enclosed spaces and heights. At the top, a heavy wooden door opened into the basement of the office building, a labyrinthine maze of storage rooms and filing cabinets illuminated by a single, flickering oil lamp. "The safe is on the second floor," Franklin whispered, pointing toward a narrow staircase that disappeared into the shadows above. Montgomery's private office, the corner room with windows overlooking the main excavation pit. They climbed with extreme care, wincing at every creak and groan of the aged wooden boards beneath their feet. The second floor was far better appointed than the basement level's polished hardwood floors. Freshly painted walls saw the expensive trappings of success built on the backs of poisoned workers and stolen resources. Montgomery's office was exactly what Evangeline had expected, a massive oak desk dominating the center of the room, expensive leather chairs worn smooth by years of use, and walls lined with territorial maps and official mining claims. But it was the corner safe that drew their immediate attention, a steel fortress that looked capable of withstanding direct artillery bombardment. "There it is," Franklin said, pointing at the imposing metal structure. "Everything you need should be locked inside that monster. But as for the combination, I don't suppose you know the specific numbers?" Evangeline asked hopefully. Franklin shook his head with obvious regret. Montgomery never trusted anyone completely, not even his closest business associates or most loyal enforcers. Ohansey examined the safe with professional interest, running his scarred fingers along the combination dial and lock mechanism. "I once knew a cavalry scout who specialized in opening security devices like this one. He always said the secret was infinite patience, combined with careful listening to the internal tumblers as they fell into proper alignment. Can you manage it? I can certainly try. He knelt beside the safe, pressing his ear against the cold metal door, while his fingers worked the combination dial with delicate, almost surgical precision. The process seemed agonizingly slow, with each subtle click of the mechanism sounding as loud as gunshots in the tense silence of the office. Outside, the stamping mills continued their relentless industrial symphony. But Evangeline found herself straining to hear other, more dangerous sounds. Footsteps in the hallway beyond the office door, voices calling out alarms, and the distinctive metallic sound of rifle hammers being cocked in preparation for violence. Every shadow in the room seemed to conceal potential threats, and every creaking sound from the building's structure made her heart skip several beats in succession. Got it. Ohanzi breathed with quiet satisfaction. The massive safe door swung open slowly, revealing neat stacks of official documents, cloth bags heavy with gold coins, and several leather-bound ledgers that probably contained years of incriminating financial records. Franklin grabbed the legal papers with hands that shook from excitement, as much as fear, scanning them quickly by the uncertain light from their small oil lamp. "Here," he said with growing excitement, pulling out a thick leather folio. The original guardianship agreement, along with all the supporting documentation and correspondence. He opened the folder, carefully revealing multiple pages, covered with official territorial seals and dense legal language. Evangeline leaned closer, studying the documents by flickering lamplight. The paper appeared appropriately yellowed with age. But something about certain sections looked subtly wrong to her increasingly suspicious eye ink that seemed too fresh in places, dates written in slightly different handwriting than the surrounding text. "Look at this specific line here," Franklin said urgently, pointing to a crucial passage with a trembling finger. "The date has been chemically altered with some kind of bleaching solution. See how the numeral 7 in 1877 appears different from all the other numbers in the document. That's because it was originally written as 1879 after your mother's death and your subsequent inheritance of the Snake River property. So the entire guardianship claim is completely fraudulent. Much worse than simple fraud," Franklin said, producing another document from deeper in the safe, a detailed survey map covered with red boundary lines and technical notations. "This explains exactly why Montgomery was so desperately determined to gain legal control over you personally." The map showed the Snake River headwaters region in precise detail, with property boundaries clearly marked and documented according to official territorial surveys. Evangeline's family holdings controlled not just a few acres of decent grazing land, but the primary fresh water source for the entire Upper Valley region. Without guaranteed access to this water supply, Montgomery's revolutionary mercury extraction process becomes completely worthless, Franklin explained with growing urgency. The new technique requires truly massive quantities of clean, fresh water to operate the amalgamation chambers effectively. The existing creek system simply cannot provide sufficient volume for large-scale operations. But with legal control of the Snake River headwaters, he could expand the Quicksilver operation into the largest and most profitable gold mining facility in all of Dakota Territory, possibly the biggest and most lucrative extraction operation anywhere west of the Mississippi River. Evangeline felt physically nauseated as the full scope and implications of Montgomery's elaborate scheme became crystal clear. Stoneheart hadn't just been purchasing a reluctant bride to satisfy some twisted personal obsession, he had been systematically stealing an entire watershed to fuel the expansion of his industrial empire. Everyone living downstream from his operations, including all the Lakota communities that depended on clean water for basic survival, would suffer the devastating consequences of his poisonous ambitions. But as she continued examining the contents of the safe, something else caught her attention, a small, ornate jewelry case, tucked away in the back corner behind the stacks of legal documents. Her heart nearly stopped beating as she recognized the distinctive silver filigree work. That's my mother's jewelry case," she whispered with growing horror. Franklin looked confused by this unexpected revelation. What would Montgomery be doing with your mother's personal belongings? She opened the case with hands that trembled uncontrollably. Inside, nestled in faded purple velvet, was her mother's most treasured possession, a delicate gold locket that Eleanor had worn every single day until her death. The piece had mysteriously disappeared from her belongings after the funeral, and Evangeline had always assumed Cornelius had sold it to pay his drinking debts. With growing dread and terrible anticipation, she opened the locket with careful fingers. Inside, exactly as she had somehow known it would be, was a small tintype photograph of a much younger Reginald Montgomery and a carefully preserved lock of her mother's distinctive auburn hair. Sweet Mary and Joseph, Franklin breathed, finally understanding the implications. Montgomery and your mother were lovers. Evangeline finished, her voice hollow with shock and revulsion. Before she married my father. Probably before she met Cornelius as well. Her mind raced, piecing together the horrible truth. That's why he wants me so desperately. It's not just about the water rights and the mining empire. In his twisted, diseased mind, possessing me is like getting Eleanor back somehow. A floorboard creaked ominously in the hallway just outside the office door. All three of them froze like deer, sensing the approach of hungry wolves, hardly daring to breathe. Another creak, definitely closer this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of boot leather moving stealthily across polished wood. Ohanze drew the knife he had reclaimed from Blackjack, not his Colt revolver, which would create too much noise, but his brother's recovered blade that gleamed with deadly promise in the lamplight. He moved toward the door, with predatory silence muscles coiled and ready to strike without warning or mercy. The office door exploded inward with a tremendous crash that shook the entire building. Well. Montgomery's familiar voice filled the room like poisonous gas seeping up from underground caverns. It appears the rats have finally found their way into the grain storage. He stood framed in the doorway, with Blackjack and Crowfoot flanking him menacingly, all three men heavily armed and clearly prepared for deadly violence. Montgomery's pale face bore fresh bruises and cuts from the saloon brawl, and his colorless eyes burned with homicidal fury that was barely held in check by his iron will. But there was something else in his expression as his gaze fixed on Evangeline, something that made her skin crawl with new understanding of just how deep his obsession truly ran. "Hands where I can see them clearly," he commanded with deadly calm. "All of you right now, or face the immediate consequences." They had absolutely no choice but to comply with his demands. Montgomery's men spread out with practiced military precision, covering all possible escape routes, while their employers surveyed the open safe and scattered documents with obvious disgust and mounting rage. 20 long years I've spent building this empire," Montgomery said in conversational tones, as if he were discussing nothing more threatening than weather conditions. 20 years of scratching and clawing and doing whatever was necessary to achieve success in this godforsaken territory. And now 3 pathetic small-town nobodies actually believe they can bring it all crashing down around my ears. "Those documents prove you're nothing but a fraud and a murderer," Evangeline said defiantly, despite the terror racing through her veins. Montgomery's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass mixed with winter wind howling through cemetery trees. "Documents can be destroyed easily enough, my dear girl. People can disappear without a trace in this vast wilderness. Money can purchase either silence or death, whichever proves more convenient for my purposes. He drew his revolver with practiced ease, checking the cylinder's contents with professional efficiency. Care to guess which option I'm currently planning for you three? You can't simply murder us in cold blood. Franklin protested weakly, though his voice shook with terror. People will ask uncomfortable questions about our sudden disappearances. Will they really? Montgomery's smile was more terrifying than any snarl of rage would have been. A disgraced county clerk who embezzled money from the town treasury to feed his gambling addiction. A runaway bride who couldn't accept her legal obligations like a decent Christian woman should. A savage who killed white men in a saloon brawl and then fled justice. His expression grew thoughtful and satisfied. Tragic story, really. Folks will shake their heads sadly for a few days and then get on with their own lives and problems. But as he spoke, his eyes never left Evangeline's face, and she could see the twisted obsession burning there like hellfire. You look so much like her, he said softly, his voice taking on an almost tender quality that was somehow more frightening than his threats of violence. Eleanor was the most beautiful woman I ever laid eyes on. Could have been mine, should have been mine if she'd had any sense at all. But she chose that worthless dirt farmer instead, threw away everything I could have given her. So when she died, you decided to take her daughter as a substitute, Evangeline said, fighting down waves of nausea. Not as a substitute, Montgomery corrected with disturbing intensity. As redemption, as the fulfillment of what should have been. When I look at you, it's like seeing Eleanor again, 20 years younger and even more beautiful. His voice grew harder, more determined. I've spent my entire adult life building the wealth and power that she should have shared with me. Now, in whatever time I have left, I'm going to have what was rightfully mine from the very beginning. You're completely insane, she whispered. I'm dying, Montgomery replied matter-of-factly. Mercury poisoning the same affliction that's been slowly killing the men who work in my mines. The difference is that I'm wealthy enough to buy whatever time I need to complete what I've started, to possess what I've always deserved. But Franklin had been slowly and carefully reaching into his coat during this exchange, and now his hand emerged, holding a small derringer, the kind of hideout weapon that clerks and merchants sometimes carried for protection against robbers. I'm sorry, Miss Porter, he said, his voice shaking with genuine anguish as he pointed the weapon directly at her heart. But Montgomery has my wife and children locked in his warehouse. If I don't cooperate completely, he'll kill them all in the most horrible ways imaginable. The betrayal hit Evangeline like a physical blow to the chest, driving the breath from her lungs. Franklin hadn't been helping them escape Montgomery's trap. He had been leading them directly into it from the very beginning, acting on the mine owner's explicit instructions. You did well, Horatio, Montgomery said with obvious satisfaction. But this delicate part of the operation requires steadier hands and clearer thinking than yours can provide. As he spoke, however, Evangeline noticed something that neither Montgomery nor his men had observed yet. The numerous steam pipes running through the processing shed walls weren't just for heating, they were part of the mercury processing system that Dr. Edwin had described. The pipes carried superheated retort steam and mercury fumes from the amalgamation chambers to cooling units located throughout the complex. And one of those pipes, she realized with growing excitement, ran directly behind Montgomery's position, near the door. Put the gun down carefully, Horatio, Montgomery commanded. Your part in this business is finished. Blackjack stepped forward eagerly, his replacement revolver already drawn and ready for use. The knife wound O'Hansey had given him was clearly still painful, but hatred burned bright in his pale eyes, like fever flames. Want me to handle the final details, boss? Not quite yet. Montgomery replied, pulling out a folded document that Evangeline recognized with sinking heart, a marriage certificate with elaborate official seals. First, I want our reluctant bride to sign her new marriage certificate and make everything completely legal according to territorial law. I'll never sign that obscenity. Oh, I believe you will, Montgomery said with chilling confidence. He nodded to Blackjack, who immediately grabbed Franklin by his thinning hair and pressed his gun barrel directly against the terrified clerk's temple. You see, poor Horatio here has served his purpose admirably, but his wife and children are still locked in my warehouse waiting to discover whether their husband and father was intelligent enough to follow orders precisely. Montgomery held out an ornate dip pen and inkwell like it was a ceremonial dagger. Sign the marriage certificate, and Franklin's family goes free to live their lives in peace. Refuse, and they'll join him in whatever unmarked grave I select for disposal of inconvenient corpses. The pen felt impossibly heavy in Evangeline's trembling hand as she accepted it from Montgomery's fingers. Behind the mine owner, she could see Ohanzi calculating distances and angles, preparing for some kind of desperate action despite the guns trained on him. But she also noticed something else, a valve wheel on the mercury processing pipe directly behind Montgomery's position. If she could somehow create enough distraction to reach that valve. That's my good girl, Montgomery said with genuine warmth as she leaned over the marriage certificate. Just like your mother, practical and intelligent when lives hang in the balance. Evangeline signed her name with deliberate slowness, buying precious time while her mind raced through possibilities and probabilities. The mercury processing equipment that Montgomery was so proud of required extensive safety systems to prevent exactly the kind of catastrophic failure she was now contemplating. There, she said, setting down the pen with a steady hand. It's finished. Montgomery smiled with the expression of a man who had finally achieved his heart's deepest desire. Mrs. Montgomery, he said softly, tasting the words. It has such a lovely sound, don't you think? But his moment of triumph was interrupted by Evangeline's sudden, desperate lunge toward the steam pipe valve behind him. She twisted the wheel with all her strength, and immediately superheated retort, steam and mercury fumes began hissing into the office through multiple ruptures in the pipe system. What in blazes? Montgomery started to shout, but his words were cut off as poisonous metallic fog began filling the room with choking, blinding density. In the sudden chaos and confusion, Ohanzi struck like lightning incarnate. His brother's knife took Blackjack directly in the chest, just as the outlaw tried to maintain his grip on Franklin. The clerk broke free and dove desperately for cover behind Montgomery's massive desk as gunfire erupted throughout the office. Get to the window, Ohanzi shouted to Evangeline through the toxic haze, an external wooden stair. But Montgomery, despite his advancing illness and the mercury fumes that were affecting everyone in the room, lunged after them with desperate fury. You're not escaping me again, he screamed, his voice cracking with obsession and rage. She belongs to me. Eleanor belongs to me. The poisonous vapors were making everyone dizzy and disoriented. But Montgomery's diseased determination seemed to make him immune to their effects. He grabbed Evangeline's arm with iron strength, dragging her away from the window toward the office door. If I can't have you, then no one will. He snarled, his face twisted into a mask of insane hatred. We'll die together just like Eleanor and I should have done 20 years ago. But as he pulled her toward the hallway, Montgomery stumbled over Franklin's prone form and lost his balance. He staggered backward directly into the massive mercury processing apparatus that dominated one corner of his office. The superheated metal pipes and grinding mechanisms that had made him wealthy were still operating at full capacity, fed by the ruptured steam lines. His screams were mercifully brief. Ohanze grabbed Evangeline's hand and pulled her toward the window as the spreading mercury contamination made breathing increasingly impossible. They crashed through the glass together, landing hard on the metal and external wooden stair platform outside. Below them, the entire Quicksilver complex was in chaos as poisonous vapors spread throughout the interconnected building systems. "Can you climb down?" Ohanze gasped, his face already showing the effects of mercury exposure. "I can try. I can." They descended the external wooden stair as quickly as their weakened condition allowed, reaching ground level, just as workers began fleeing from buildings throughout the mine complex. Behind them, Montgomery's office was completely engulfed in toxic fog that would make the entire structure uninhabitable for months or possibly years. As they staggered away from the industrial complex toward the relative safety of the surrounding hills, Evangeline looked back once at the empire that greed and obsession had built and that justice had finally brought crashing down. Stoneheart Montgomery's reign of terror was overended not by outside intervention, but by his own poisonous ambitions turned against him. Judge Edmund Blackwood arrived in Deadwood 1 week after the Quicksilver disaster, traveling with a territorial marshal and a small army of federal investigators. Unlike the local officials who had been either purchased or intimidated by Montgomery's influence, Blackwood possessed a reputation for absolute honesty that even Stoneheart's vast wealth couldn't have tarnished. The legal hearing was conducted in the town's largest saloon, hastily converted into a makeshift courtroom, with the judge's bench constructed from whiskey barrels and rough planks. Nearly half of Deadwood's population crowded inside, drawn by the promise of finally seeing Montgomery's criminal empire brought to justice. Evangeline sat in the front row with Ohanze and the recovered Franklin, the documents from Montgomery's safe spread before them, like evidence of divine intervention. Dr. Edwin had also come forward, bringing his meticulously maintained medical records that documented the systematic mercury poisoning of mine workers. Even Mary, the schoolteacher, was present, ready to testify about the intimidation tactics used against anyone who dared question Montgomery's methods. This court recognizes that the defendant, Reginald Montgomery, is not present to answer these serious charges. Judge Blackwood began with appropriate gravity. However, given credible evidence of his death in the mine office accident, we shall proceed with determining the legal validity of certain documents bearing his name and official signature. The questioning proved thorough, but scrupulously fair in its approach. Franklin explained in detail how he had been coerced into forging the guardianship papers, showing the judge precisely where dates had been chemically altered and signatures duplicated with considerable criminal skill. Edwin testified about the systematic poisoning of workers and the deliberate contamination of water sources downstream from Montgomery's processing facilities. Most damning of all were Montgomery's own private records saved from destruction by Evangeline's quick thinking during their escape. The ledgers revealed years of criminal activities, bribing territorial officials, falsifying mandatory safety reports, and using violence and intimidation against anyone who threatened his operations. Based on the comprehensive evidence presented to this court, Judge Blackwood announced, after deliberating for less than an hour, "I find that the guardianship document purporting to transfer custody of Miss Evangeline Porter to Reginald Montgomery is fraudulent and completely without legal merit. Furthermore, I hereby order the immediate seizure of all Montgomery holdings pending thorough investigation into his extensive criminal activities." The crowd erupted in enthusiastic cheers and sustained applause. For the first time in years, someone had successfully stood up to Stoneheart Montgomery's tyranny and emerged victorious. That evening, as they prepared to leave Deadwood permanently for the safety and peace of the open prairie, Dr. Edwin approached Evangeline with one final revelation that sent chills down her spine. "There's something you should know about the circumstances surrounding your mother's death," he said in hushed, confidential tones. Something I've suspected for a long time, but could never prove. What do you mean? I examined Eleanor's body after she died, and the symptoms weren't entirely consistent with the fever that supposedly killed her. Certain signs suggested she might have been exposed to mercury compounds over an extended period. Edwin's expression was grimly serious. Given what we now know about Montgomery's obsession with your mother, I believe he may have been slowly poisoning her, hoping to make her sick enough that she would turn to him for help and comfort. The revelation struck Evangeline like a physical blow. You think he murdered my mother? I think he killed her through his twisted idea of love, yes. When she continued to reject his advances despite her illness, he probably increased the dosage until... Edwin shook his head sadly. It's all speculation now, of course. But the patterns fit what we've learned about his character and methods. They departed Deadwood before dawn, riding north toward the Lakota camp, where a pony and the children waited anxiously for their return. The town slept peacefully behind them, no longer crushed under the oppressive shadow of Stoneheart Montgomery's malevolent influence. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, like a green ocean grass rippling in the wind, with mesmerizing rhythm. Somewhere out there lay a completely new life, free from fraudulent contracts and guardianships, and the poisonous reach of men who believed they could own other human beings like livestock. Where will we go from here? Evangeline asked as they rode side by side through the strengthening morning light. There's excellent land near the Black Hills, Ohansey replied thoughtfully. Far enough from the government agencies that we can live in relative peace, but close enough to established towns that the children can receive proper education, if they choose it. And what about us? He was quiet for several long moments, carefully considering his response. I cannot offer you the comfortable life you were raised to expect. No fine dresses or elaborate house, no servants to attend your daily needs. I never wanted those things anyway. What do you want most from life? She thought seriously about the question as their horses picked their way across a shallow creek, the water running clear and clean, unmarked by industrial contamination. What did she truly desire? Freedom, certainly. Safety for the orphaned children who had become her responsibility. A genuine chance to build something worthwhile, instead of merely surviving from day to day. And this remarkable man beside her, scarred and dangerous, and completely unlike anyone she had ever known, but who had risked everything to save her from a fate worse than death itself. I want to be somewhere I'm genuinely needed, she said finally, where I can make a real difference in people's lives. With me, with you, she confirmed without hesitation. He reached across the space between their horses, his work-hardened hand covering hers where it rested on the saddle horn. Then we'll build something together. Something that can't be bought or sold or stolen by men like Montgomery. They rode in comfortable silence after that meaningful exchange, following ancient game trails and creek beds toward an uncertain but genuinely hopeful future. Behind them, smoke from the abandoned quicksilver mine still darkened the sky, a permanent reminder of the empire that greed and obsession had built, and that justice and courage had brought crashing down. 2 months later, they stood together on a windswept bluff overlooking the Snake River, watching the first snow of winter dust the prairie grass with crystalline beauty. In the valley below, construction had begun on a small school building, the Whisper Wind Academy named, in honor of Ohansey's grandfather, who had passed peacefully in his sleep just weeks before. No man wants me. Evangeline had said that terrible night at the river crossing, convinced that her only value lay in settling other people's debts. How completely wrong she had been. The right man had wanted her not as property or payment for someone else's obligations, but as a partner in building something worthwhile and lasting. something that would outlast Montgomery's poisoned legacy and grow into a beacon of hope for generations yet unborn. As the first serious snow began to fall, Evangeline Shadow Walker, for that was the name the Lakota had given her, took her husband's scarred hand and walked toward the future they would create together. A future where freedom and love mattered more than gold or power, or the toxic ambitions of men who believed they could own human souls. Behind them, the prairie wind sang through the grass with sounds of peace and promise, carrying their footsteps toward tomorrow.